Ever heard the one about the record-breaking team who went from non-league to the top flight and played European football in 5 years and then fell into oblivion just 2 years later? No, didn't think so. This is a story that makes what's happened at Wrexham in recent years look pretty normal when you dig into it. It's got everything. A chain-smoking insurance magnate, one of Sir Bobby Robson's most trusted lieutenants, a free-scoring doctor, and much, much more. This is Gretna, a marriage that went wrong. Welcome to Gretna, historically beloved for aficionados of matrimony, owing to Scotland's more relaxed attitudes to marriage which existed up to 1847. This small town in the borders has a few other claims to fame. It's got the 𝗘𝗫𝗧𝗏𝗠𝗘 stone, it was an important customs post in the 17th century, and the factory there made a load of cordite in World War I to help British firearms. But for a few years, it was also the place where one of the most rapid rises ever in European football history took place, that brought Gretna FC from the English Northern Premier League to the Scottish Premier League, via a Scottish Cup final and an extremely brief sojourn in the UEFA Cup. And it all starts with a man born in a completely different country from where the club is based, England. This is Brooks John Joseph Mileson, born as one of 5 in the Pennywell estate in Sunderland, notable prior to his investment in Gretna, which we'll get to later, for breaking his back aged 11 after falling into a quarry and being told he'd never walk again, then winning the bronze medal at the 1967 English Cross Country Junior Championships, and making somewhere between £50 and £75 million through insurance companies. Mind you, he had a few goes at business before he got it right. He was director of 14 companies in his career. To some, Brooks was a dreamer and a philanthropist whose generosity knew no bounds. For some, read Gretna players who were afforded extravagant lifestyles throughout his tenure at the club. To others, he was an egomaniac who left a trail of devastation in his wake. Anyway, while he was making his millions in Carlisle, across the border, Gretna FC were tolling in the Northern Premier League, where they'd been for 10 straight years, having failed previously to gain election to the Scottish Pyramid. They'd had a couple of FA Cup runs in their time, but had pretty much failed to bother historians for the most part. In 2002, one club's demise was another's moment to rise. Airdrieonians folded, despite finishing runners-up in Scotland's second tier that year, and Gretna won election to play in Scotland at the expense of the newly formed Airdrie United. The club would enter the league in the Scottish 3rd Division. Expectations weren't exactly high, but at least they wouldn't need to go to England for every away game from now on. At the time, Gretna averaged crowds of just over 400 at Raydale Park, which isn't actually that bad considering only 3,000 people live there. Brooks saw the potential at the club. He'd been pouring money into supporters' trusts at Stockport, Berwick, Ayr, Dundee and Dundee United, and having failed to take over Carlisle United, a £20,000 donation to Gretna's youth development scheme gave him skin in the Scottish game. Brooks came to the club with deep pockets and a defined vision, telling the club's manager at the time, Rowan Alexander, "I want to be in the Scottish Premier League in 5 years." Conservatively, you'd have called him misguided, but history tells us he was anything but. Their debut campaign ended with a 3rd-placed finish in the bottom tier in 2004. That was the springboard, and Brooks began to splash the cash. Practising doctor and prolific striker Kenny Duker joined from East Fife, and that campaign brought them the league by 20 points, a plus 101 goal difference, and 38 goals in just 36 games for the good doctor. There were more high-profile arrivals from big Scottish clubs, and Gretna made it back-to-back promotions in 2006 and won the league by March of that year. What really caught the public's attention though was their run in the Scottish Cup. They beat 4 First Division sides on their way to the Hampden Park showpiece to face Hearts, and became the first club ever to do so from the 3rd tier. They lost the game on penalties after a 1-1 draw, despite the manager going full kilt and sporran for the occasion. But they did gain entry to the UEFA Cup for the next campaign. Now you might be thinking that the wider football world was willing them on as the plucky underdog. Everyone loves a football Cinderella story, right? Well, Gretna proved that this isn't always the case. Envious glances from elsewhere and cries of annoyance over the wages they were paying while playing in front of crowds in the hundreds meant that the footballing fraternity were waiting for it all to fail. You might have guessed though that the Gretna house was in fact built on sand, but we aren't quite there yet. As the next season rolled around, Gretna were in the 2nd tier and heading into Europe. They didn't get the glamour tie they'd hoped for though, and got roundly thrashed 7-3 on aggregate by Derry City in the 2nd qualifying round of the UEFA Cup. If they'd won, they'd have faced Paris Saint-Germain. Brooks had continued to bankroll the club's endeavours though, and the spending was unrelenting. In came Sir Bobby Robson's former assistant Mick Wadsworth to run things, and he later said, "I saw more jeeps in the club's car park than in the Normandy landing." Everything was coming out of the chairman's pocket though, and while results on the pitch continued to get Gretna nearer to the top flight, the line of credit was beginning to run out. Things started going wrong when the architect of their rise, manager 𝗬𝗏𝗓𝗍𝗓, was put on gardening leave when their form hit a wobble. They were top at the time, but Brooks felt it was the end of the road for him. Without Alexander, Gretna did their best to blow an 11-point lead, and questions were being asked as to whether or not the club really wanted to make the jump to the SPL. It all came down to a dramatic final day when it looked like St Johnstone under Owen Coyle would pip them to automatic promotion. James Grady scored for Gretna though, and the helicopter that was en route to present the trophy to Coyle at Hamilton had to divert to Ross County. The dream was realised for Gretna, but the nightmare was just about to begin. They'd become the first club to go from bottom to top with 3 consecutive promotions in Scotland or England, but they definitely weren't ready for the big leagues. Cries of derision went up from other clubs over the state of their stadium. It couldn't hold the 6,000 fans required for the SPL. A deal was reached to share Motherwell's Fir Park for home games while Raydale was renovated, but inside the club, the realisation was hitting that their benefactor was living beyond his means. He'd paid for everything for staff and players at the club, but his wealth didn't resemble that of an oligarch's bottomless pit, or come from a nation state. With an unsustainable business model and no wholesale recruitment in the summer of 2007, the Gretna bubble very quickly burst. Try as they might, the team just couldn't compete at the highest level, and they lost 25 of their 38 SPL games, and the club's infrastructure creaked under the expectations of playing at the top level. But forgetting all the players' boots for a game against Rangers brought some gallows humour at the time. Rumours of missed payments for wages became commonplace, and the owner's health was beginning to suffer. Aged just 60, he was admitted to hospital with a brain infection following successive stomach operations and suffering chronic fatigue syndrome. And that was the beginning of the end for Gretna. Without their benefactor, they were staring into financial abyss. They were quickly placed into administration, given a 10-point deduction, and liquidation looked inevitable. Wadsworth even sold his car to pay the players. Their only SPL campaign ended in April 2008 in front of 431 fans and saw them amass just 13 league points. Gretna's financial issues meant they'd go back to where they started in the 4th tier, because they couldn't guarantee they could play all their games the next season. August 2008 brought liquidation, and in November that year, Brooks Mileson died after suffering a heart attack at home and falling into a pond. His fortune gone, and the club he loved now in oblivion. So that's the story of the meteoric rise and stratospheric fall of Gretna FC. Less a failed marriage in keeping with the town's history, more a spectacular love affair that burned bright but brought destruction to all involved.